Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today to participate in this virtual conference session on this timely topic, migrant decision-making in pandemic times. This session 5 is part of the Conference on Migration and the Future of Work, Canadian and Comparative Perspective in Pandemic Times, which is organized by the Canada Excellence Research Chair, CERC, in Migration and Integration, Ryerson University, Canada. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Helen Sayed. I'm the Executive Director of the Esselska Research Center of Excellence at Esselska University, Egypt. I'm really pleased to be the chair for this conference session. My role will be to manage time effectively and to facilitate our panel discussion. I look forward to a fruitful and dynamic discussion. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Please note that all participants are muted by default to avoid interrupting our three speakers during their presentations. If you are facing a technical issue with the webinar, please use the chat function that appears on the bottom right corner of your screen. The session will be recorded and posted on the CERC's website. Please feel free to start asking your questions to our speakers or providing us with your comments as of now and throughout the session using the chat function. I will be collecting your questions. Let me share the agenda of our session. First, there will be 3 presentations of about 15 minutes each given by our speakers. Then there will be a 30-minute Q&A session. Also, CERC in Migration and Integration will be hosting a 20-minute virtual coffee session or coffee break at the end of the conference session with CERC's researchers and select panelists from today's session. So if you are interested in joining, please stay on the same Zoom call. I will now quickly introduce our speakers. Igor Grossmann studies people and cultures, sometimes together and often across time. As an associate professor of psychology at the University of Waterloo and director of the Wisdom and Culture Lab, his interests span multiple disciplines and methods, including big data, intensive longitudinal surveys, and behavioral experiments. Francis Collins is a professor of geography and the director of the National Institute of Demographic and Economic Analysis at the University of Waikato. Francis' research explores international migration in the Asia-Pacific, focusing on the regulation and experience of temporary migration, the relationship between migration and cities, and conceptualization of the driving forces of migration. Shamira Madani is a transformative leader with extensive experience working with licensing bodies, settlement agencies, and higher education and post-secondary sectors in Ontario. She served as the chief architect of several government programs that enable highly skilled immigrants to obtain employment in their fields. Shamira is now the managing director and deputy executive director for World Education Services, WES, in Canada. This session brings us together to share our experience and thoughts about how past research can inform our understanding of migrant decision-making in pandemic times. Migrant decisions are complex. They are all about what makes individuals want to migrate and what makes it possible to convert these migration aspirations or intentions into actual migration. Migrant decisions relate also to the migration mode in terms of pathways, facilitators, and routes, and to the migration destination preference. Past research has shown that migration decisions involve a series of considerations, including economic, social, and cultural ones. But as we will see today, with the pandemic, new factors come into play, like health risk concerns or public health policy. A better understanding of migrant decision-making can contribute to safer migration practices. First, we will hear from Igor about the evolution over time of the study of migrant decision and the role of less tangible factors that may shape migrant decision-making. Igor, please, the floor is yours for about 15 minutes.
Thank you. Let me start to share my screen, and hopefully this will all work. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me to be part of this panel. I will try to give a general overview of decision-making and try to make it applicable to the context of migration and migration uncertainty. This is the work, by the way, that I've been doing together with my star undergraduate honor student, Chelsea Chen. So huge kudos to Chelsea for helping me connect the dots. Let's start with the basic observation of mainstream theories on migration. Theories on migration and the underlying decision-making process span multiple disciplines. That's why we're all here. They include economics, sociology, political science, geography, and demography. And scholars from these disciplines try to contribute different frameworks to conceptualize migration and migrant decision-making. Generally, when I looked at these different frameworks, I see that there are certain similarities between some of them, as well as differences. Some theories emphasize a more functionalist approach. Others emphasize cultural, historical, or historical structural perspectives. From these theories, the factors that influence migrant decision-making include such things as perceived economic opportunity, earning potential, political stability, proximity of origin to destination countries. Generally, when we think about this type of theories, they seem to focus on fairly general, systematic, macro level factors. There's this idea that a migrant is a rational decision maker who has access to all the necessary information. This information is accurate and reliable. It's easy to use such a framework because it makes for easy models to integrate from the top-down policymaking perspective. Unfortunately, such a model is, in most cases, inaccurate, and that's something that was probably evident to most of us before the pandemic started, but becomes even more clear as we are embracing various uncertainties. These models are generally kind of out of sync with actual processes coming through migrants' head when deciding where to move and considering the immense uncertainties associated with it. This is something many of us probably relate to, including myself. In my life, I've moved more than 3 times. And since the first immigration of my parents from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, I remember that the decision-making process that went through their head had nothing to do with the factors of rational choice theory that I will get through in a second. So in this talk, I want to review some of the core insights from psychological research about decision-making that apply to the context of migration. And these factors may help to shed some light on the role of uncertainty and the context, including the upbringing of people and the culture that they're coming from. Generally, when we think about this idea of a rational decision maker, we're talking about the idea of the rational choice theory. Here's a picture of Gary Becker, who popularized this concept in economics and political science. It assumes that social behavior can be derived from behavior of individual actors. It characterizes the rational behavior as goal-directed and evaluative or reflective. It follows the principle of so-called choice axiom satisfaction. In particular, if you follow this idea of homo economicus that is still popular in neoclassical economics, the idea of self-interest, that everybody is trying to pursue their self-interest. And if everybody does that, then according to Adam Smith, we'll all be better off in the long term. In the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, gave theoretical approaches, and von Neumann's formulation of expected utility function made it very attractive for people to add in certain equations when formulating the rational choice theory. And here's a picture of John von Neumann. And the interesting part here is that von Neumann focused really on outcomes, not premises. And he really made it very clear in his writing that this was a mathematical possibility and not really anything that must be real in the real world. However, the ideas about the expected utility function took their own form and have since been applied very widely in the economical and political science literature. One example of this is George Stigler, Nobel Memorial Prize winner in economics, who said that the economist doesn't need ethics, only arithmetic. His task is to clear up social mistakes. Why do you care about motives? Why do you care about context or cultures that the person may be coming from? Why do you care about uncertainty? You shouldn't. Now, of course, in reality, and we since have known that this type of model doesn't apply. We've known it for a while before the Great Recession, but the most probably profound insights about the role of human decision-making biases and uncertainties comes from research by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, as well as Dick Thaler, who, like many others before them, emphasized that social agents don't really calculate some kind of, don't follow an abstract rational formula to calculate the utility of what is good for them. When it comes to decision in everyday life, especially in a context that is uncertain, where you don't have all information available, you just follow some pragmatic concerns, as Bourdieu would have called it. You feel the game. You don't really follow game theoretical principles as a human being. You often act irrationally. You prefer some other considerations, civic considerations sometimes, even if they come at the expense of your own interests. Humans also show systematic biases in their decision-making, and they're bounded by evolution and cognitive limitations, including their general architecture. Let me just provide you with a clear example. Imagine you're playing a game. You're given $10 that you can share with another anonymous player, or you can keep it to yourself. What will you do? According to the standard of rational self-interest, you should keep the money. After all, you don't know who the other player is, and you will never see them again, and they will never know who took the money. However, you may have considered sharing the money, maybe a third, maybe even a half. And in reality, that's exactly what happens. People violate, in the so-called dictator game, the principle of rational self-interest. So the question is, why is it that some people apparently do follow the self-interest and others do not? When we started looking, for instance, at this question, we observed that what really matters here is the framing that people are using. Sometimes we understand that the rational thing to do is to take all the money. But if I ask you to act reasonably instead of just rationally, what you do, you follow a completely different social norm. Instead of taking the money, and here you just see the distribution in this type of task, you would often give half of it away. Really, people have very different understanding of good judgment than the one that is emphasized in economics. The one that is emphasized in economics and political science defines rationality through this sort of set of abstract rules and formal logic. Whereas this kind of idea of reasonableness that is often popularized in our everyday decision-making goes more hand in hand with civic considerations. So here, by the way, on the top you see reasonable, not rational, and on the bottom you see rational. These are the most common terms that people in everyday life associate with those concepts. And whereas rationality is understood as something that follows some kind of logic, preference maximization, is reductionist, People also have this idea of reasonableness where you are more likely to be context dependent and you have to balance different norms of interests, and you cannot really reduce it to some kind of common denominator because it's often unknown what you're supposed to be following. So bottom line is that in the context of uncertainty, often the standards that people are following in their everyday life do not necessarily follow this idea that we often assume them to do, especially in economics. And bringing this back to the discussion, this basic insight to the discussion about migrants, migrants often are not likely to possess all information. They don't know all the parameters that they need. So consequently, they may not necessarily be able to even engage in this kind of rational decision making. And instead of that, other processes, civic potentially process, may be at play. What really matters for migrants is the context. And the context of migrants varies quite a bit. On the one hand, you can have an international student who may be interested in pursuing personal growth and comes for a study to a different country without an expectation that they will stay there. On the other hand, you have the temporary migrant worker who is motivated by economic prospects or tends to experience insecurities and loneliness to much greater extent potentially than the international student. Or you could have a highly skilled migrant who would be generally more low self-esteem, higher job dissatisfaction, and more work-related stress, and who will feel potentially that they are underutilized in the workforce and are potentially underemployed. So not all migrants are alike, and it's very important to recognize different type of motivations and contexts of people who immigrate and the reasons why they immigrate. What is really important here also, and of course I didn't include, this is just like a sub-selection because there are many other forms of migrants that we can discuss later on, including refugees. But what is really important is that the context and cross-cultural factors matter. One factor that we know matters is the social class. This type of rational, abstract decision-maker characteristics that I presented to you as endorsed in economics and political science and political economy is often more alike to the description of an upper middle class American or Canadian, or a highly skilled migrant. It follows from the principle of the modernization thesis, where the idea is that white sort of color versus blue collar occupations are more likely to afford and demand autonomy and self-direction. Consequently, and we have found in multiple psychological studies and sociological studies that people who are more likely to engage in this type of jobs are more likely to focus on themselves, think outside of the sort of like contextual bounds, whereas people from the low SES background are more likely to think pragmatically. They're more likely to embrace this type of reasonable standards where they would be more sensitive to social and civic considerations. Some studies even suggest that they're more empathetic. Consequently, their decision-making would look very different. And depending on the social class of the migrant and the type of job profile that they're moving because of, their decision-making may vary as well. This is just like an example from some of the studies that we have done where if you look at the level of education, different type of reasoning strategies may be employed, and sort of more pragmatic reasoning strategies are more likely to be employed by people without higher education. The other example of where culture and context matters for decision-making in particular is the concept of morality. So there's research that suggests that humans use basic mental models to coordinate social interactions. And these models can be communal, they can concern authority considerations, they can concern equality, or they can be based on this type of economic market pricing considerations. Now, these different forms of social considerations may be more or less likely to be present in different cultural groups or cultural contexts. And consequently, the decisions that people may be making may vary. Sometimes even the perception of action as moral or immoral would depend on the motives and relationships in a given context. And so if somebody is moving from one context to another and migrates from one context to another, what they would perceive as acceptable and the reason that they would be considering in the migration process may vary quite dramatically. This can even include acceptance of violence or acceptance of inequality or other type of impure acts. So they may be perceived as morally correct depending on the moral motive employed and how relevant social relationships in this context may be construed. So this is the work by Alan Fisk and many others that suggests that this type of different systems that we may be considering that we are socialized and grew up in may fundamentally shape how we'll be then making a decision, including about the country that we'll be moving into. So overall, cultures vary in preferences for different forms of sociality and for consideration of social concerns in their migration decision-making. Finally, the other last point that I would like to raise here is that cultures change. And even though what I just presented to you about these 4 forms of sociality may be true in a given snapshot moment, we also know that there's fundamental shifts that have been happening and continue happening, especially now in the pandemic period over time. And one thing that I would like especially to highlight here is this concept of digital nomads, where we have a relatively high number of international migrants that has remained stable. More people from developed nations are now becoming international migrants, choosing to work digitally in a growing gig economy, which is somewhat different from what we have experienced before. And we don't really have clear-cut models, I think, for understanding the decision-making process, especially in the post-pandemic world. And where we also have this kind of idea about globalization, technological advancement, transfer of products and labor. And so to wrap up, what I think is needed, and this is just to provide some context, is we need to go beyond the theories of migration that just more top-down, and instead of that, integrate theories that come from different perspectives, from different disciplines together, go beyond policy-oriented research, or consider how we can integrate fundamental scientific insights about a person's day-to-day decision-making into the policy-oriented research, and consider how decision-making unfolds from a psychological perspective, as well as keep in mind that the type of psychology that people bring with them varies quite dramatically from one culture, from one region to another, and changes over time. And that's all I wanted to introduce to break the ice. If you have any additional questions, please let me know. You can reach me either via email or Twitter or other forms. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Igor. I think that rather than focusing on general drivers, you showed us that subjective aspects are key to understand the migrant decision-making. I would like to remind our participants to send their questions. They have the chat function to do so. Francis, could you jump in and share your thoughts about the potential impact on the pandemic on the migrant decision-making? You will have 15-minute presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Helene, and thank you also, Igor, for that opening presentation. It links very nicely into some of the things that I'm going to talk about, but from a different perspective, perhaps less the psychological and more kind of post-structural account of how we might think about migration decision-making, or I'm going to problematize that term as well myself. So I think we all know that the COVID-19 global pandemic has substantially altered the norms around which international migration occurs and is understood, which is what I'm interested in here. Almost overnight, some countries have shifted from a focus on managing large-scale flows of migrants and travelers to almost complete border closure. That is certainly the case here in the context I speak from, Aotearoa, New Zealand, a settler colony at the bottom of the South Pacific, which has shifted in the space of a month from having record high net migration rates, I'll talk about in a second, to an almost complete end of migration, except for the movement of citizens and residents. As migration researchers, especially those interested in the drivers of migration, I think it's really interesting to think about how we understand this situation. We might ask, has migration simply been put on hold for a while, delayed until vaccines, new border regimes, or other kinds of resolutions are implemented? Has it been disrupted such that immigration trends are potentially being directed in new ways or stopped while we wait for new immigration flows to begin in the next normal? Or are we in the midst of witnessing a reconfiguration of the way in which migration occurs, is generated, and critically is managed and responded to? Now, clearly, I can't answer those kinds of questions to a conclusive extent in a presentation like this, not least because of the fluid circumstances within which we move, the fact things seem to change all the time, and significant variations between different national contexts. I do think, though, that as migration researchers, we can start to now direct our attention to how we understand and conceive migration and think about the kinds of lessons that we can learn from existing scholarship in terms of establishing new ways of thinking about emergent or reconfigured patterns into the future. So in that context, what I want to do in this particular presentation is explore the notion of migration decision-making and to make the case for alternative understandings of the generation and configuration of migration that do not hinge on individualized, atemporal, and aspatial conceptions of choice. So you'll see some linkage there with some of the things that Igor has talked about. In doing so, I'm going to do something a little bit different from Igor, in that I'm going to draw on recent literature exploring aspiration and desire as a conceptual vocabulary for understanding a migration, as well as some of the important scholarship that's emerged around migration infrastructures and migration industries as significant mediating forces in flows, in migratory flows and experiences. Let me begin with the story of Natasha James, which I've drawn from news reporting. This is not a research participant. So Natasha's story, I think, speaks to the complexity of migration, of decision-making as an enduring feature of mobility, and the interruptions generated at the intersection of pandemic conditions and migration management approaches. Natasha came to Aotearoa, New Zealand to become a nurse. She was a nurse in South Africa, but in order to work in New Zealand, she of course needed to complete a competency assessment program before gaining registration. While she had a family then, she decided to migrate initially by herself, and for her husband and 3 children to follow a few months later. She traveled with all the family's belongings so she could set up home before others arrived. Now, having arrived here on the 20th of January 2020, Natasha was unwittingly thrown into a situation of severe disruption to her migration and family life. Her family did not arrive before the border closed in New Zealand in mid-March, and at the time this article was written in January 2021, they remained in South Africa while Natasha cannot leave New Zealand without the risk of losing her ability to return, because as I said before, it's only citizens and residents who are currently able to return to New Zealand. So like many other migrant families in Aotearoa, New Zealand, she has become separated from her family by government responses to the pandemic. Migration in this sense is delayed, but also disrupted as well. Now, I present this story because it demonstrates how migration cannot be understood as generated in single moments of decision and action. Even outside of the pandemic, Natasha's movement hinged on socially situated considerations within the family. It was interlinked into uncertain progression through occupational status, that is, she had to get registration to be a nurse, get a job to be a nurse, and then potentially become a resident later on. So there's no kind of single moment that's going on there. And to various actions established around movement and settlement that are tied to, for herself, imaginings of future life. So rather than linear lines of thought, calculated choice, and action, this migration is necessarily characterized by uncertainty, even pre-pandemic, multiple potential outcomes, and considerable contingency on both border regimes and mediating factors and actors. The onset of the pandemic and its effect on Natasha and her family only reinforces the problem of seeing migration as resultant from individual choice and action. It is, as I think this case would suggest, fully contingent on a wide range of human and also more than human actors and systems that make possible some and block other forms of movement and adaptation. Now, this presents researchers, I think, with a very interesting set of conceptual and methodological problems in relation to understanding the current upheaval in migration. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as I've said before, we've seen a complete bottoming out of migration flows as a result of government border closure and controls. So this chart gives you a sense of that. Since 2013, and particularly since 2015, there's been very significant high rates of net migration gain that have resulted from shifts in migration policy, and in particular the implementation of new temporary migration programs that have facilitated significant increases of people on work visas and international students. You can see if you look at the charts at the end, and these are monthly levels here, that you're looking at net migration exceeding 5,000 monthly from the middle of 2019, and even 10,000 monthly in the early months of 2020, which is quite significant for a country of about 5 million people. It then plummets to only a few hundred in April 2020, a level it's remained at ever since. So from one perspective, migration has seemingly come to a halt, and public commentary now is hinging on questions about the effects of diminished immigration and whether returning citizens and residents, which are the only ones making up those few hundred entering the country, will be sufficient to address long-standing issues of labour market gaps, as well as the role that a growing population has had in underpinning economic growth. However, this view of migration is defined by border crossings, that is, that singular moment of crossing the border, I think is problematic because it obscures the shifting contours of migration governance, not just here in New Zealand, but indeed in Canada and Australia and other places as well. And in particular, the way in which temporary migration programs have led to a complex and uncertain staging of migration as constantly provisional. So this chart gives you another account of migration. This is a population count of people on different kinds of visas in New Zealand. The blue line there is people on recent resident visas. So they can live long term, but their visas have only been issued in the last 5 years. The red line is work visas, so people on temporary work visas, and the green line are international students. You'll see that one of the most significant trends is a substantial growth in the number of people on work visas over the last 10 or so years, alongside a bit of a growth in people on international student visas and a decline in the number of people holding recent residence visas, which aligns with the number of people coming out of those work visas. Now, these population counts are connected because a substantial proportion of work visa holders and many international students aspire to gain residence rights, but very, very few are successful in that endeavour. And in fact, if you think about the growth in the number of people on work visas, there's actually proportionally fewer people are gaining residence over time. Now, the pandemic has not altered this situation very much, especially in regard to work visa holders. While you can see a bit of a reduction from mid-2020 onwards, most of those are working holiday visa holders rather than a much larger number of labour market tested work visas, their partners and children. Many of these people have been churning through work visas for many years, even before the pandemic, maintaining appropriately skilled jobs in order to qualify for the next work visa, even as regular changes are made to the requirements for work and residence. Migration then, as I said before, does not end when a border is crossed. And neither do the decisions or choices involved. As Natasha's story made clear earlier, the pandemic has upended even further this already tenuous existence, disrupting well-laid plans for gaining residence and successfully settling in communities. While in the context of the pandemic, the government has issued, the New Zealand government has issued several blanket 6-month extensions, these only delay the onset of further uncertainty, have done little to address the widely reported anxiety amongst migrant communities. So from my perspective, these conditions, both before and then exacerbated by the pandemic, demonstrate the ongoingness of migration and its unpredictable directionality. These movements are cut through and redirected by decisions and actions at multiple points. They're mediated by actors such as immigration agents and employers, and regulated and managed by the ever-shifting contours of the migration and border regime. A focus on migration decision-making, I think in this kind of context is quite problematic, particularly an orthodox one, and I think Igor's told us a lot of that. I won't really add anything to that necessarily, except to say that in addition to the points that, that Igor has made, I would suggest also that migration decision-making tends to focus on particular moments, the singular moment of choice, usually prior to departure, as a distinct generator of migration, rather than seeing migration as part of historically constituted processes of movement, friction and stasis. So it's quite atemporal in that sense. But beyond that, I'll just sit with what Igor said. From my perspective, I think any focus on my decision-making needs to get beyond this kind of methodological individualism and start to situate motive forces of migration in relation to future projections, agency or ability, emotional and social forces, and assemblages of regimes, imaginaries, actors, and materialities. So one way in which you can do this, which some of my colleagues such as Jürgen Carling do, is to focus on aspiration and ability, two notions of both what people perhaps want or think that they want and their ability to act on that. That's an interesting approach that draws attention to migration as a kind of two-step or potentially three-step process of decision-making and then tied with particular kinds of circumstances. And I think we can see some interesting insights that emerge from that. My own emphasis has been to focus on the conceptual vocabulary of desire, the embodied and emotional forces that generate and direct action. So getting beyond this kind of notion of in-mind thought and in-body action, and actually trying to think about mind-body as interrelated. Recognizing that desire acts to bring different bodies, objects, territory, and ideas together in new and transformative relations. Desire in this respect is not just a synonym for what I want or what I'm interested in. Rather, a focus on desire, I think, highlights at least three things. Firstly, it suggests that actions are socially generated rather than resulting only from internalized individual cognition. Desire is often about the desire to be drawn into another world, to become part of things, rather than desire for specific objects. Secondly, the importance of imagination, the coding or framing of certain things, certain actions, maybe migration, or people as desirable is fundamental in generating impetus to act, certainly within the accounts of migration. Lastly, desire is also transformative. It is about the making of worlds, and as such, it cannot be fully controlled, even in the context of migration where states might seek to do so. Desiring migration is political then in itself, and so we see migration is actually, because of its ongoingness and because of the continuing presence of migrants, is something that can actually be quite problematic for states trying to deal with a pandemic, trying to think about border regimes, trying to think about the morals and ethics of controlling movement. So in addition to questioning the centrality of individual rationality at the core of decision-making, I would also argue that we need to do more to connect broader understandings of the generation of migration to other recent bits of scholarship on migration industries and migration infrastructures. So as some of you will know, the emergent study of migration infrastructure and industry has been a very important feature of migration studies in recent years, particularly in Asia and Europe. These literatures have demonstrated that migration fundamentally involves actors beyond the state and migrants, and more broadly that migration hinges on socio-technical platforms of facilitation and control. Such a view also highlights that migration itself is often not singular, but is rather stepwise. So once we recognize that migration agents, employers, NGOs and others are involved in facilitating migration, we start to see the multiple steps that take place within a particular migration trajectory. As Lynn et al. Describe it, infrastructure then is not simply a background factor in migration, but influences the very possibility and shape of movement in migrant life. Infrastructures create unequal categories of migrants. They are reinventing migration as a series of cultures and norms that on the one hand serve to discriminate against certain mobilities, and on the other present themselves as windows of opportunities to other migrants. So infrastructures, industries, the kinds of actors who are involved in that are fundamental to shaping what we understand as migration. So what does this mean in the context of the current pandemic? Well, firstly, I think much of the infrastructures that existed pre-pandemic are still there. So if we're thinking about border controls, if we're thinking about the importance of migration agents, brokers, NGOs and others in facilitating movement, that's still the case. But pandemic infrastructure and regimes, if anything, seem to be intensifying some of the characteristics of contemporary migration. So border closures, surveillance, delayed and suspended immigration processing, special exemptions, further advanced screening, vaccine certifications and passports, and much more. These governing techniques are both in play and in development and can be understood as new forms of experimentation with how migration might look like in a post-pandemic world. They also articulate with the ways in which people desire for or seek out migration in different kinds of ways. I'm noticing my time, so I'm just going to move on a little bit quickly to finish up.
1 minute. Yeah.
1 minute. So what does this mean for how we think about migration decisions in pandemic times, or more conceptually for my purposes, the desiring processes that underpin migration? Certainly, we can see how an increasingly regulatory approach to public health in relation to migration will shape the agentive capacities of migrants, potentially blocking desire, redirecting the impulse to move towards other destinations, or putting it on hold for some time. The stories of people like Natasha also highlight the suspension of much agency and the limited ability that migrants subject to non-citizen conditions have to direct their own mobilities, and also to follow desires in broader arenas, such as in family and other social matters. Given uncertainties around these situations, desire through migration also intersects with anxiety and other emotional forces that are likely to enhance the social and emotional marginalization of migrants who are in precarious positions. Going forward, however, we also need to be alive to the possibility that current experimentation around health-based border controls becomes part of the new normal, either because it is genuinely necessary for public health reasons, or because like the securitization move of the last 2 decades, it simply becomes a common sense tool for managing movement. Desiring migration and the narration of choice or decision are shaped by these conditions, which will give rise to certain migratory possibilities while limiting others and simultaneously producing migrants, whether healthy, skilled, wealthy, unskilled, unhealthy, as desirable or undesirable subjects who might be targeted in different ways for inducement or, I guess, friction in a post-pandemic world. So I've got this last slide on conclusion here. I'll just leave that as it is. Perhaps what I'm suggesting here is that migration is delayed, disrupted, or is it delayed, disrupted, or reconfigured? Probably all of those things. But I think we actually need to really take this opportunity to think about the ways in which some of the interesting literatures that have emerged around the generation of migration might reshape how we think about decision making and the ways in which it's shaped by broader sets of infrastructures and regimes of control. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Francis. This brings us to the study of Shamira, who has been collecting data on interests to migrate to Canada during the pandemic. So please, Shamira, the floor is yours for about 15 minutes.
Okay, sharing. So I'll take 15 minutes, and my presentation is quite different from Francis and Igor in that, what I've heard in terms of setting the context, it's almost like a funnel approach. Igor's presentation talks about rational, irrational, reasonable in terms of the decision making, and with basically Francis, context matters. It's about human, economic, financial factors, etc. So basically my presentation is very much about individuals and their decision-making process, understanding the context and what, we don't know what their thinking was other than a survey that they filled out, and what their decision is going to be with respect to immigrating to Canada. So the reality is that they might have all these context factors, but what I have is information with respect to, do we want to come to Canada or not as a result of the pandemic? So it's really from a practical perspective. In terms of basically, trying to move this slide. It's not going to the next one. Hold on. WES basically is a global organization that assesses academic credentials. We are one of the service providers for Canadian immigration, and we basically assess about 500,000 applications per year. And we do a lot of surveys to understand, what the thinking is of people before they come and after they arrive. So as soon as the pandemic happened, we basically felt that we needed to understand what the impact was on the decision-making of individuals as basically the borders were closing down, immigration processes slowed down, and the infection rates went up. In terms of just giving you a sense of what the profile was, we distributed almost 480,000 surveys to individuals who basically had applied to come to Canada from January 2018 to July 2020. And we used 3 different time periods. So April 15th, which was immediately right after the border started closing down, June 15th, as we were deep into the pandemic, and then August, where we were between the first and second wave. We had about 27,930 individuals who responded, about 7.7%. And we had asked them about 12 to 14 questions, depending on whether they answered yes or no. In terms of the profile, as you can see on this particular slide on the side, the gender balance was equal, male, female. The age was pretty interesting with respect to the fact that you had a very large number, 93% were between 25 to 44. So, working age. So again, that talks about motivation in terms of, why they were responding. And And with respect to the country of citizenship, really what we saw is India, the largest, which is the largest country that basically has a number of immigrants coming to the other countries. Nigeria second, and then the others, the 25% others, the percentages were really small. What you don't have in front of you, and we basically have a published report, is we also looked at basically the country of residence. So citizenship is birth and then residence. Where were people when they basically filled out the surveys? And the profile changed slightly. India was still number one. Nigeria was two, but you now had a large number of people saying that they were residing in UAE or the US. So that became sort of an interesting nuance in terms of where they were when they started responding to the surveys. When we looked at basically, what is the interest in immigrating as a result of the pandemic, the slide is pretty self-explanatory, April, June, August, and the different colors. The headline here is that the respondents who basically answered the question, their interest in Canada grew as we ended up with more infections happening in Canada, and our unemployment rate continued to go up. So as you can see, the first in terms of what's happening here, you had individuals who said that from 38% in April that they wanted to come to Canada to 46%. The middle bar here, it says no impact. These were individuals who had already put in their applications probably even before the pandemic, and they'd already started the process. So there was no impact in terms of their interest. So it's really the first bar and the last bar, which shows that it didn't matter what was happening and whatever the factors were, they were still interested in coming to Canada no matter what. When we looked at this particular question, and this question where we were digging deeper, is we wanted to understand whether people actually wanted to delay coming to Canada as a result of the border closures and unemployment rates. And the other thing that we wanted to understand is, did they want to go to other countries other than Canada? And so what you see here is that, in fact, the plans to delay immigration peaked in June, and you ended up with, by August, people still said, we want to come. It doesn't make any difference. Some of the questions we asked around delaying, so, just to give you some examples, because there are many factors that we put on the table around delaying. So personal or family hardships. While we were suffering a recession in Canada, they were also suffering a recession in their home countries. So did that mean that they couldn't afford to come anymore? Or things like travel restrictions or contracting the virus now as our virus numbers were going up, or an economic recession in our country. It didn't make any difference. In fact, individuals said that they weren't necessarily planning to delay if they were able to come. And what was more interesting for us is that their interest in going to other countries, they weren't really interested. There was no comparability. So it just demonstrated that Canada continued to be an interesting choice for individuals to come. In terms of the economic recession, basically the green line is where you could see that a recession in Canada would have had no impact. Almost half the respondents said it doesn't matter if you have a recession in Canada, and they knew the unemployment rates. And they also knew that, in fact, the sectors and the occupations that were the hardest hit were the ones where immigrants usually come to. So retail, tourism industry, etc. It didn't make any difference. They felt that a recession wouldn't prevent them from still wanting to come to Canada, because when you look at our details, it showed that the countries that they were coming from, the recession there was higher, and they felt that in terms of hopes and aspirations, would be worse for them if they continued to stay. If we now look at the jobs outlook in the sectors, if you look at the bottom of this particular slide, what we did was we looked at, their own particular jobs, but also the sectors. And as you can see, the sectors that they came in at the bottom were generally equal. And again, it didn't make any difference. You basically had 48% of the respondents indicating that the decrease of jobs in their sector occupations would have no impact on their plans to immigrate. And when we looked at basically what happened between April and August, and you did see some changes in the other questions, in this question, it was fairly consistent. Didn't make any difference. So in terms of, so what does that mean generally? And I've given you really a speed dating kind of drive through, and there are many more questions and details. The reality is that our federal government and our Minister of Immigration has basically said that as a result of our decline in the population, our demographic profile, low birth rates, we would like immigrants to come. So in fact, literally October of last year, a decision was made through cabinet that we would basically start off with 401,000 new immigrants who would be allowed to come, 60% fully or economic immigrants. This is the largest since basically 1913. We have 1 million immigrants who have come in the last 3 years. Again, many are highly skilled. We know that they want to work in their occupations. With the next 3 years starting this year, we're looking at targets at a 1.3 million people who are highly skilled. So different from the lower immigrants. And, you know, already we can see they make up a quarter of our workforce. We know that there'll be 100% of our labor force because of the number of retirements. And so the question that we have been asking ourselves as you see the survey results is people want to come anyway. And so what does that mean generally? And so, you know, we basically did a survey just before the pandemic hit, and we had released this survey. And the survey demonstrated that less than half of skilled immigrants in the economic class who had BAs, MAs, and PhDs were working in the same sector as they were pre-immigration. You know, almost half had health education from abroad, and they were either unemployed or underutilized. And we've seen what's happening with the pandemic. And we know for a fact that a large number of, for example, what we call personal support workers in nursing homes might have been registered nurses, might have been physicians. And we basically lose their skills and education as time goes on. I've seen the chat as it's going on around the low self-esteem. When they come, if they don't actually end up getting a job in the first 6 months in their sector, they stop being relevant in terms of the skills and experience. Over time, they lose their self-esteem. And then you end up with, you know, all kinds of issues that come up. And so this is very important with respect to people still want to come no matter what. And are they going to come to a situation which may be the same, maybe worse because of the pandemic? This particular slide I'm putting up because, you know, all these countries are what we call jurisdictions that are competing with Canada. So they also struggle at low birth rates, aging population, trying to attract a large number of international students because international students are young, and their pathways to basically let them become landed immigrants. And it's also supports our post-secondary institutions. And these are economic immigrants who are highly skilled and problem solvers. But, you know, are we basically bringing people in and undervaluing or underutilizing their skills and education? And we are, you know, when I went on LinkedIn and people knew that I was doing this presentation, the question that I was asked is, but this is great, you're saying everybody wants to come. That was a very large number of people who want to come. But, you know, is one country's brain drain another country's brain gain? And is it really? So, you know, I'll just finish off here by saying that what becomes really interesting in terms of the motivation, it's complex, it's human behaviors, it's the economic factors, it's context. in terms of where they're coming from and where they're coming to. But I think that we really need to think very intentionally that even if people want to come, do we need to be doing things differently while people are still overseas to ensure that their skills are recognized? And I know that Australia does that. It might be a barrier, or immediately after they arrive, that we leverage those skills. So I think I might have saved us some time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Shamia. As you said, what could be interesting to see is the potential impact of the pandemic on the ability to convert this interest in migrating to Canada into actual migration. We may get back to such question later on. So I think this is time now to open the floor to our audience. There were already some questions in the chat, mostly talking about the implications, practical and policy implications of the first two presentations. So let me just ask the first question to Igor and maybe Francis. I would like to hear your thoughts about the new ways of thinking the interplay between migration infrastructure and health. With the pandemic, some migrants became stranded, willing to go back home but not able to. Some others received home orders or were deported. So how can the interests of migrant workers and other types of migrants be better protected during this pandemic? I would like to hear your thoughts about that. Maybe first, Igor?
It's quite a loaded question. Hard to understand, of course, what are the contexts, the different migrants who are in different situations experiencing. We do, first of all, need to probably recognize that those contexts vary, as you just pointed out, and that depending on the circumstances, different things may be affordable to them. What we can do beyond that is probably dependent on the policymakers and on the ability to make rules more contingent on the context that the person finds themselves in. Because if you just apply as a blanket rule for everybody, that would probably penalize those who are most vulnerable, and often that includes migrants, especially those in the low-income sector. So I guess that would be my first sort of recommendation, but I'm not a specialist, so I mean, I don't know. I would need to see more data. I would need to actually do some research in order to be able to provide a more than just an educated guess.
I see, I understand. Igor, Francis?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's a really interesting question, loaded, perhaps as Igor put it. I'd see it in two different parts. So the first part is about infrastructures and how they're connected into health, and seems like, I guess, the management of migration. Seems to me that we are witnessing slowly the incorporation of much greater emphasis on health within migration regimes and movement. And yes, we can see exactly why that's happening, because we're in a global pandemic. What I think we're also seeing is experimentation such that becomes a new norm going forward, whether or not it's necessary. Much like securitization became such a big thing in the early 2000s, and it's just become common sense now. So I think that's going on. But then I guess leading into the other side of the question, which is the political side of the question, I guess that, like many of us know, the pandemic has revealed or heightened the obvious inequalities and marginalization that already existed pre-pandemic. And so I think what we probably would be saying is, rather than saying how do we protect the rights of particular groups, including migrants, we might say, what's wrong with current non-citizenship based migration regimes that have become quite common? And I'm thinking here particularly temporary work programs and the like, where people are denied access to the things they need to survive something like a pandemic. And why have we come to see that as normal and acceptable for countries like New Zealand, like Canada and others. So I guess I'd see it in that sense. You want to address the rights of migrants, actually need to transform the system that underpins the diminishment of those rights. It's not about the pandemic. The pandemic shows us the problem. It's not the problem in itself.
Mm-hmm. I see. Thank you very much, Francis and Igor, as well, for your answers. I would have another question to get back to your approach regarding the fact that past research on migrant decision-making has overlooked at subjective or psychological factors. This may be linked to the fact that there are some methodological limitations. So to what extent do you think that this research gap in the literature was the reflect of the limitations of both the dominant research methodologies and also data availability, especially at the micro level? And do you think that there are new research methods used to overcome these limitations to incorporate these psychological subjective drivers that shape the migrant decision-making? Igor, maybe, would you feel comfortable in answering the question?
Again, it's almost a political question. We can approach it from the question of your approach to philosophy of science, of course, and what a good or bad methods are. I would step away from that and just say that the reason why this type of research is not, well, there are two reasons. Number one is lack of interdisciplinary work and often siloed approaches in different subfields. Economists are doing their thing, political scientists their thing, demographers their thing, and psychologists their thing. And it's rare that you actually have forums where one can help another to shed light on an additional level of analysis. But the other issue is, and that is to some extent linked to the methods, the reason why, for instance, psychologists and decision makers are not focusing as much on immigrants is because they have often this erroneous assumption that all people are alike, and they're just studying some kind of underlying architecture. And just by sampling one person, you can generalize to everybody else. And of course, that anybody who has been in another culture knows that that's probably a huge mistake, but that has been a limitation of much of psychological and behavioral and social science research in general. There's this concept that some friends of mine coined the weird cultures, which is Western educated, rich, democratic. And that's us here in Canada and in the US. In fact, even here in Canada, we are somewhat different from the Americans, who tend to represent 95% of all behavioral social science studies ever published. So that's the first problem. And then the second problem that is like, well, if you're not interested in culture, then of course you will not be interested in immigration, because that's like a transitional process that includes a dynamic component, as both myself and the second speaker pointed out. So I think I would start there. And yeah, so we need more interdisciplinary work. We need to go beyond just our myopic perception that everybody is the same everywhere. Our decision making is influenced by our upbringing, is influenced by our culture, and it's changing over time. And if we integrate those insights, and I think we will be able to have a richer discussion about migrant decision making from different angles, be it psychological or political.
May I add something, Ellen, if you don't mind, in terms of the question and a response? I think from an abstract perspective, it does make sense, and I'm looking at Anna's question, all the various factors that go into decision making. From a practical human behavior perspective, even if we try to do the intersectionality of all the questions that we put on the table and then send a survey out, the reality is that context matters, and families make different decisions based on different things. When we came to Canada from East Africa, it was not for an economic reason. It was because of health issues that, a family member had. And so, it was important for my father to leave with 2 young daughters to make sure that we were okay in case something happened to him. It was not for an economic reason. And yet the assumption is that it would have been an economic reason. So, you know, the question that I ask all of us is that we could do straight surveys. We think that we could basically put all these considerations and factors, but the reality is that families will make decisions based on their context and what they aspire to go to. So I just want to put that on the table as another response.
Thank you very much, Shamia. Francis, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. So, I mean, I guess the science of migration, or the philosophy of science of migration that Igor was signaling there is quite central in this. I think there's actually quite a lot of alternative methodological approaches that are already in existence and used and have been for some time within migration research, and as well as analytical and theoretical perspectives. But I think the big growth in migration studies as a field, or this kind of semi-field that's emerged and grown rapidly in the last 10 years, has emerged in a way that has been very policy oriented, and that's okay. Creates certain kinds of problems. It creates a kind of mainstream that speaks to certain kinds of knowledge assumptions, and those were some of the knowledge assumptions that I was certainly trying to unpack there, and I think Igor was a little bit as well, about, say, decision making. It's something that policymakers rely on, so researchers who want to speak to policymakers also accept that black box of decision making, regardless of what other alternative approaches might suggest, and then they go with that, and then we talk about other things. And so I think part of the issue is not the availability or the or people actually doing work that's shifting things in other directions or giving us other understandings. It's that the kind of politics and knowledge around migration are somewhat constrained when we try to speak to the practical matters of policy and the political matters of crossing borders. So yeah, I'd see things in that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. So I will select some questions from the chat. There are some for Shamira, the practical ones that I will select now. Just 1 minute. Regarding the how do demographic and immigration policies work together in pandemic times in Canada? How much of that is regulated by the labor market? And additionally, if Canada has a surplus of immigrants willing to migrate, what role decision-making play then? So this is a question for you, Shamira.
Sure, and it's a really good question, and I'm not going to be able to answer it directly because it's complex. Governments make policies based on what they feel is right for the country. So when you have a government that says our population needs to grow, our demographic profile is changing, we need more economic immigrants at the macro level, decisions are made as to levels and mix. You then have provinces that have a different role that they play because each province could be different in terms of, you know, what is required in the labor market. And then you have immigrants and immigrants from particular countries who have different reasons, rationale for why they want to come. So the reality is that ultimately, I think that what needs to happen is what we're doing right now. And that is to have policy discourse and have conversations around, so, you know, what is the behavior insight that's taking place? What are the considerations? Government policy making, could we influence or advocate for government to make different decisions based on what the data shows and what the motivation of people would be? And then what also becomes important on the other side is the last 2 or 3 slides that I talked about, is that it isn't just about bringing people in. These are people's lives that we're disrupting. And so for me, it becomes a conversation that is at different levels, vertically and horizontally, so that we can influence policymaking. And employers have to play a role too, because we haven't talked about employers at all here. But ultimately, the people who hire are the employers. And they said they have a labor market shortage, but we haven't got it right in terms of where the jobs are, where the future jobs are, and what jobs are going to disappear. So we make assumptions, and then when they come, those jobs are no longer there, or we don't recognize their skills because they're very different. So again, I'm not answering the question directly. I think that it's a number of considerations, conversations need to happen so you can start influencing public policy, doing more analysis and more survey data. That's more than, do you want to come to Canada or not? You know, what are the factors?
Thank you, Shamira. I have a follow-up question for you from Naomi. She is asking where there are significant differences in responses from the different source countries or origin countries of respondents.
Oh yeah, so basically we didn't see a lot of difference in terms of the source countries. The largest group that responded, as you could see from our response rate, was India. And so generally that was what basically took over in terms of then all the other responses that we got. So it was basically India and Nigeria. All the other countries are so small, so that, you know, if you ask me the question whether the response is really different, it would have been the top 2 or 3 countries that I talked about. And so we do know that a lot of people from India would like to come to Canada. It's 48%. So, you know, that would have basically been the lens in terms of how people were responding.
Thank you, Shamira. I have a question for all the panelists from Dr. Anna. Francis, in your presentation, you concluded noting that we need to consider decision-making beyond the singular event. So would you have some observations about how the migration project is shaped over time and the decision-making is shaped by changing emotional and cognitive factors and changing cultural and socio-economic context? So maybe I will start with you, Francis. Do you have some piece of thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, so that's an outstanding question, and I think it's a really, really important one. It's a little bit hard to provide a coherent answer for without drawing on specific examples. So I mean, but I think if I think about the previous research I've done, I think about so a lot of the research I do draws on biographical approaches to interviewing. So when I interview with people who are on the move or planning to move or in some kind of situation in relation to migration, I'm interested not just in understanding, you know, why they made a particular choice at a particular point in time, but actually understanding backstories and understanding where people have grown up, what kind of relationships have been built up over time, what kinds of experiences have shaped who they are and how they see themselves and what they want in the world and how that is limited by constraints or opened up by different kinds of relations and networks and opportunities. And I say that because when you start to do that, you realize that, or at least for me, I realized that the particular instance of movement, while sometimes you can find a rationalized account of why that happened at a particular point in time, often it's embedded in other much deeper and much more longer term processes of orientation to being mobile in the world, or a disruption in a particular country, for example, in terms of economic context or political situation, or in terms of family members who have shifted overseas who then provide assistance, or an encounter with a particular person, a particular interlocutor. So it could be a migration agent, but it could be the auntie who's already moved to the Middle East to work as a domestic worker or a nurse who says, oh, give up what you're doing and come here. I can help you. And then provides a linkage that perhaps was never there in the first instance. And I think that's really, really important to do, because not only does that stretch out and give us a much deeper understanding of what drives and generates movement, but it actually shows how it's given shape at the same time. So migration is not just, oh, I want to migrate, so I'll do that and now select some countries. It's actually those processes are twinned and interlinked, you know, which takes us right away from a kind of atomized, calculative notion of decision making, which kind of is, I think it's sometimes presented as the Excel spreadsheet version of the world, where people say, I'm going to migrate and here are the 3 countries I'm thinking about, and I'm going to choose this one because it's better. And I actually think when you start to talk about people's narratives and biographies, you see that the whole, what we call the decision is embedded socially and historically in people's lives, and it's shaped along the way. And that's not to give some kind of notion of destiny or something like that, but a kind of sense of path dependency emerging in the ways in which people move in the world. So I guess that's the kind of account I'd probably offer.
Thank you. Igor, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I like a lot of the points that Francis just made. I do think it is important to consider the narrative and the way how people experience their immigration journey over time. Now, I want to push back a little bit on the idea that the narratives are always trustworthy, because most cases, as we know in psychology, they're not. People post hoc justifying and rationalizing a lot of things, especially if you move and you gave up a lot and you moved because of your auntie. Well, just from my personal experience and from my parents' experience, there were a lot of justifications happening, and those justifications change over time. Now, they may be meaningful in their own right, but they don't necessarily reflect the motives and the unconscious reasons that contributed towards the move in the first place. So that's just something to keep in mind. I just think that measuring, and you can do it in a quantitative way, you can do it in a qualitative way. Ideally, you maybe want to do both. Across multiple time points, it's really meaningful. And when you do it, you can integrate the contextual factors that Shamira was talking about. And then you can, you can go nuts. You can do quantitative analysis. You can do a mixed model sort of analysis using qualitative methods. But it is very important to include them, and in part because otherwise you are succumbing to all sorts of logical fallacies where you infer processes that may be happening over time that do not correspond to individual differences that you're actually observing. That's just something to keep in mind. So like the level of analysis that we're interested in, which is the change and potential change in your perception and motives that may be influencing you, you cannot derive it by just observing people in a single shot, by taking one slice. You really need to track it over time.
Thank you, Igor, for that. Shamira, there is a question for you from John. He says that some expressed the concern that we should not be admitting so many immigrants during a recession, because it's worse for immigrants themselves, in that sense that they would suffer in our labor market. What do you make of an argument in light of how people responded to your survey? So how can you relate both?
And it's the same answer that I gave and talked about a few minutes ago. It's all about context, and people have different reasons as to why they choose to come. And they're adults, and they basically are sometimes way more resilient than people who might have been born here, in terms of giving up everything that they have in life to come to another country to start from the bottom and succeed. So my perspective is that we've got to let adults make decisions as to why they want to come, and what the risk factors are and what they're sacrificing, because I don't feel that we or government or researchers could say, well, you shouldn't come because of the following, etc., etc. One of the things, even as Igor and Francis answered the question around the motivational factors of surveys and the different ways to do the surveys, I am familiar with focus groups with people after they've arrived. And the question that is asked of them is, would you have made a different decision if you had known that you couldn't get into your occupation, it would take longer? And, my experience is that, in fact, they say the decision wouldn't have been any different, that they would have come anyway, that if it meant that the children did better, then that was okay. So it would be great to do a survey after people arrive, almost like a longitudinal study, to say, what were the decision considerations, and after you arrived, what happened, and would you have done things differently, and then watch in terms of how successful they were as time went on. Sorry, long answer to a simple question.
No, but I think this is very interesting, and the fact that we are looking for longitudinal surveys is very important when we want to understand the decision making of migrants. So since we are almost out of time, I would like to quickly go back to each of our panelists and ask them in 30 seconds, what is the main message that you would like the audience to take away? I will start with Igor.
I think the main message for me is that we have to realize the uncertainty of migrant decision making. This uncertainty is involving balancing different interests, and not just one thing that you keep in mind, and you have all available information at hand, and you're just picking this one country that you would like to move to. That's not how the migration process works. Often migration is need-based, it's motive-based, it's affective, it's unconscious. And that's just something to keep in mind when we discuss how migrants make their decisions a priori before moving.
Yes, thank you, Igor. Francis?
Yes, so agreeing with Igor on that front, and then adding that we need to be understanding what we're here calling migration decisions as contingent and as relational. That is, that they are embedded in all sorts of social networks and structures, so that we can't separate them out. And I think that we really need to be careful about the individualization of migrants or any other subject as making decisions at particular points distinct from social settings and conditions around them, and that there's a lot of shaping and that goes on in that kind of process of what we call decision making. Thanks.
Thank you. Shamia?
Sure. For me, there are two messages, one the opposite of the other. The first is individuals, potential immigrants still want to come, and they'll come. You know, we basically have a very high target for 2021. They'll come no matter what, as soon as the borders open up, because that's what we're seeing. The other side of that is really that we have to, at least in Canada, be very intentional around supporting people who are coming anyway and leveraging their skills for our economy. And so it's not a matter of just people arrive and then it's like you're on your own. Being really intentional from a policy perspective, from a programmatic perspective, from a funding perspective, because they're highly skilled, they're educated, they don't need basic services, they just need a quick path into the labor market. So those are the two messages I want to leave behind.
Thank you very much. I think this is time now for us to close the Q&A. Thank you to the speakers, and thanks to the colleague at Ryerson University who organized, who helped organize this session. I think that all that is left is to thank all the participants in this conference session and to wish you a great end of the day. Thank you very much.